The Western civilization of this century is threatened not by one, but by two world revolutions of major dimensions. In both, their real compass, their profundity, and their workings have so far escaped recognition. The one comes from below, the other from without. Class war and race war. The one now lies to a large extent behind us, although its decisive blows, in the Anglo-American zone for instance, are probably still to come. The other first becomes definite in the World War, and it is rapidly acquiring direction and form. In the next few centuries, both will fight side by side, possibly as allies. It will be the severest crisis through which the white peoples will have to pass in common, whether united or not, if they intend to have any future. Such a revolution from without has set itself up against each of the past cultures also. It has arisen invariably amongst the hopeless, downtrodden races of the Outer Ring, savages or barbarians, who were exploited without means of redress by the unassailable superiority of a group of culture nations which had reached high maturity in their political, military, economic, and intellectual forms and methods. This colonial style is present in every high culture, but such hatred did not exclude a secret contempt for the alien life form, which as it gradually became familiar, was scoffingly analyzed and in the end boldly evaluated according to the limits of its efficacy and no more. They, the outsiders, saw that many things could be imitated, and that others either could be rendered innocuous or were not so potent as had been supposed in the first panic. They looked on at the wars and revolutions occurring within this world of ruling nations, and were perforce initiated into the mysteries of armaments, economics, and diplomacy, and thus came at last to question the reality of the foreigner's superiority. And once they detected a weakening in these foreigners' resolution to command, they began to reflect on the possibilities of attack and victory for themselves. Thus it was in China in the 3rd century BC, when the barbarous peoples north and west of the Huanghe and south of the Yangtze Kiang were drawn into the decisive battles of the great powers, and in the Arabian world of the time of the Abbasids, where the Turkish-Mongolian races first appeared as mercenaries and then as masters. And thus it was in the classical age above all, where we have an exact picture of events, which resemble at every point those towards which we are irrevocably moving. The barbarian attacks on the classical world begin with the Celtic movements after 300 BC, which invariably had Italy as their objective. In the decisive Battle of Sentinum, 295, Gallic races supported the Etruscans and Samnites against Rome, and they were also employed with success by Hannibal. About 280, other Celts conquered Macedonia and northern Greece, where in consequence of internal political struggles all state power had ceased to exist, and they were checked only at Delphi. In Thrace and Asia Minor, they founded barbarian empires over a Hellenized and partially Hellenic population. Somewhat later in the east of Alexander the Great's decayed empire, the barbarian reaction against the Hellenic culture set in, forcing it by innumerable insurrections to give ground step by step. Thus, from about 100 BC, a Mithridates, in alliance with South Russian savages, Scythians and Basturni, and counting upon the ever-increasing determination of the Parthians to push from eastern Iran towards Syria, had reasonable expectations of destroying the Roman state, in the chaotic condition to which class wars had reduced it. Not until it reached Greece was his advance stopped. Athens and other cities had joined them, as well as certain Celtic races which were still established in Macedonia. In the Roman armies there was open revolution. Individual sections fought against each other and the commanders killed each other in the very presence of the enemy, for example at Fimbria. It was then that the Roman army ceased to be a national body and transformed itself into a personal retinue of individuals. The soldiers that Hannibal had led against Rome in 218 were not really Carthaginians, but drawn in the main from the wild races of the Atlas Mountains in southern Spain, and with those Rome had later from 146 onward to wage a terrible and never-ending struggle. It was the losses of these wars that brought the Roman peasantry to revolt in the Gracchan disturbances. With these same peoples later, still, the Roman Sertorius attempted to found a state of opposition to Rome. After 113 BC, there came the Celtic Germanic onset of the Cimbri and the Teutons, which is only repulsed after whole Roman armies had been wiped out by the revolutionary leader Marius, and he again had just returned from his victory over Jugurtha, who had armed northern Africa against Rome and by bribing the Roman politicians had for years prevented any counteraction. About 60 BC, there came a second Celtic Germanic movement, Suevi Helvetii, to forestall which Caesar conquered Gaul, and at the same time Crassus was defeated and killed by the Parthians. But that was the end of reaction by expansion. Caesar's plan for reconquering the Alexandrian Empire and thereby removing the Parthian menace was never carried out. Tiberius had to set back the frontier in Germany after it had proved impossible to replace the troops annihilated in Varus's defeat. The first great insurrection of the frontier legions had taken place on the death of Augustus. Thenceforward, the policy was that of systematic defense. But the army was taking in more and more barbarians. It became an independent power. Germans, Illyrians, Africans, Arabs sprang up as leaders, while the men of the Imperium sank into the felodom of perpetual peace. And when the great attacks came from north and west, it was not the civil population alone that treated with the invaders and passed voluntarily into subject relation to them, the late pacifism of